would say grab your Bible, but we're going to be moving faster than you probably want to keep up in your Bible tonight, so maybe just take a deep seat for a second. Last week we left off with Joseph having, because of his relationship with the Pharaoh of Egypt, having been given the opportunity to bring his family in answer to or relief of a famine that the world was suffering from, was allowed to bring his family, his father and their household, into Egypt to occupy and settle in the most lucrative places in Egypt. In other words, some of the most fertile soil, some of the most beautiful areas. And it appears that during the lifetime of Joseph, most of Israel, which at this point really isn't a nation, but they're building toward that, most of their time in Egypt was very comfortable. They were well provided for. They were given many opportunities. They were free in many respects. But you remember we left off, or we ended our study last time, and well, let me put a comma there and let's back up and tie the string back that we're tracing through history. You remember that God made a promise to Abram initially, who became Abraham, that among other things, your family's going to occupy a land that's going to be your own, that you're going to become a great nation. And that through your seed, singular seed, through someone in your line of descent, all nations of the earth will be blessed. And I made the comment to you that promise, those promises are really unfolded and revealed one step at a time throughout the remainder of Bible history, all the way to the New Testament, because it's not until the opening of the New Covenant, New Testament, recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, both or all four, that the fulfillment of that promise is finally realized when Jesus is born on the earth, that God comes to earth, and he, a descendant of Abraham, lives a sinless life, and of course is sacrificed to become a blessing to all nations, that every man, all men and women everywhere, would have access to a relationship with God through the blood of Christ. A promise that began in the mind of God long before the creation of the world. But the promise was made all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, and that's what we were talking about, and we're tracing that theme throughout Bible history. Now, where we find ourselves at this point is we're 3 generations removed from Abraham. Where the promise originated, it was followed through with his son, his grandson, and now his great-grandson. And we have that little family clan of about 70 members in Egypt. And you remember that in order for the promise of God to Abram to be fulfilled, at least the physical ones that we recognize easily at this point in history, in order for a man to become a great nation, he first has to have a son, has to have an heir. And that's a miraculous provision that God, you remember the birth of Isaac, in spite of the fact that Sarah and Hagar's story and Ishmael being born and all those things. But beyond that, how in the world can a man with one heir ever anticipate becoming a great nation? And that's what we're seeing unfold right now in Bible history. That little family unit of 70 members comes into Egypt as guests because of God's work through a man named Joseph. A very unlikely story, as we said last week. But as time progresses and things continue, that little family group, prospered by God, becomes much more than that. They begin growing and multiplying in number, to the point that by the time we open the book of Exodus, the book of Genesis ends its record with the death of Joseph. And the book of Exodus picks up at that point, basically, and tells us that when a new king who Joseph meant nothing to came to power in Egypt, things changed. And the reason they changed was because of the number of the Israelites was very intimidating. Now, I've said, as we've studied, those of you that have studied some form or fashion of Old Testament history with me before, that several things have to happen in order for Abraham to become, or his descendants to become, a great nation. One of them is it's going to take more than one person. And that somehow an heir is going to have to be born, and that heir is going to have heirs, and we're going to have to multiply the number of people to qualify for actually becoming a nation of people, right? That's got to happen. But in order to fulfill the promise of God, not only does a number of people have to be amassed, but they got to have a place to live. And you remember that God told Abraham, the land on which you're walking as he journeyed north to south through what we now know as the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, the land west of the Jordan River between Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, that little strip there, that the land on which you're setting foot and walking through now will one day be the possession of your family. But they're not there. They're in Egypt, right? So there's several things that have to happen in order for God to make a great nation out of Abraham's descendants. The one about the number of people is happening as we speak, right? It happens in Egypt. 70-member family, roughly, come into Egypt. And some historians guess maybe 1.5 million leave 400 years later, 430 years later. So the number of people is accomplished while they're in Egypt, while they're captives. But to put a comma at that point, after Joseph dies, things change for Israel. They go from being an honored guest in Egypt to being a threat to the new king, the new pharaohs. And they began being treated harshly. They began being treated as slaves and servants rather than as equals and peers, right? As guests. And a young man, of course, we see the plan of God unfold, that every child in Bible class, if they've been there for a few weeks, knows by name and how he was born and how he was preserved. A young man named Moses was born under the circumstances of Pharaoh in Egypt being intimidated by the Israelites. And one of his strategies was to keep the Israelites from becoming overpoweringly numerous, was to have the male children slaughtered, killed, murdered. To let them be born, but to kill them immediately after birth. And of course, God intervened, as he always does, to bring about his will, his plan. Initially, the midwives that were commissioned with the job of killing the male children, they didn't. They chose not to, and they told Pharaoh, well, the reason we don't is because they're already born by the time we get there. You know, there's no sneaking around and killing a child in secret when it's already been born by the time we get there. And God blessed them because of their good treatment of the Israelites. But beyond that, Pharaoh finally just issues the decree throughout all of Egypt. Every Hebrew child that's born as a male is to be killed. Period. End of sentence. No questions asked. Moses is born, and of course, through the providence of God, his mother spares his life, puts him in this little bulrush reed boat, sets him afloat on the Nile River at just the right time in just the right place with the current flowing in just the right direction. And he ends up in front of Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter decides she's going to adopt this child. And since she's probably pretty young, and since she hasn't given birth to this child, she's going to need someone to nurse the child. Lo and behold, guess who she recruits to do that job? Anybody know? Moses' mom. Isn't that interesting? What are the odds, right? What are the odds? Well, Moses grows up in Pharaoh's palace. He's the son of Pharaoh's daughter. I mean, that has to bring a lot of opportunities, right? A lot of privileges. Egypt is an amazing place in history at this time. Amazing place, wealthy. A lot of great things are going on in Egypt. To be born as an heir, even partially, to Pharaoh's lineage or family of the palace at this time in history, well, it presented amazing, probably beyond our understanding. But there came a time, because God appeared to Moses and called him. Now, when I say he called him, what he did was he put a bush on fire, you remember, and got his attention, and yet the bush was never burned up. It didn't disappear. It just kept burning. Just kept burning. And Moses walks up to see what's going on, and of course you know the story. God told him to take his shoes off. It's holy ground that you're standing on. And it wasn't the ground, it was the God who was in its presence there that made it holy. God commissions him, he calls him, he tells him, I want you to lead my people out of Egypt after 400 years. And of course, Moses is reluctant. There's a long series of events, of discussion that takes place between God and Moses, and I really am tempted to go read it, but if I do, we're going to get stopped there, so I'm not gonna. Because it says a lot about human reluctance in the face of God's will, and a lot of lessons to be learned there. It's powerful, powerful dynamic. I mean, the exchange between God and Moses saying, I'm not qualified, I'm not sure, I don't think I can, who am I? On and on and on, and who am I going to tell him sent me? And God identifies himself. There are just so many powerful things there in that little section. Finally, Moses and his brother Aaron end up going to Egypt, demanding the release of the Israelites, God's people. And it turns out now the Israelites have become pretty important to Egypt. They started out being guests. They ended up being slaves because we're afraid of them, and we're going to have to control the population, keep every part of their life under our thumb, to now Egypt has become dependent on their labor, right? They've used this million slave national workforce to their advantage long enough that their economy and their world has become dependent on it. And Pharaoh says, let them go. You're out of your mind. It's not going to happen. Who would do the work, right? Who would build all this stuff? Who would make all these bricks? And just on and on. And God, of course, through what he calls a mighty hand, finally convinces Pharaoh to let God's people go. 10 plagues. You know those. Whether you know the name or not, you know the series. It ends in the death of the firstborn, not just of the Egyptians, but of all the Egyptians' cattle, sheep, donkeys, dogs, cats, every firstborn of everything in Egypt, on the night that God chose, dies. Now, the dilemma is Israel, the Hebrew nation, the descendants of Abraham are in Egypt. And God makes an exception when he tells them that if you'll sacrifice a lamb and sprinkle the doorpost of your house with the blood of that lamb, I'll spare you. I'll spare your house. And of course, that began another very powerful study about the price of sin, or the price of conquering death, being innocent blood, and having it applied at the appropriate time and place and circumstance that resulted in everybody else suffering the consequence of God's judgment, while at the same time those who were covered by the blood of the Lamb were spared, right? Beautiful, beautiful picture. I mean, a very emotional picture. But God sends the death angel to pass over those on whom the blood of the Lamb has been sprinkled. And of course, the unleavened bread and the hasty leaving and all those things that were to become an annual celebration, which, by the way, was what Jesus and the disciples were doing in the upper room the night that he took the bread and the cup and really explained what it meant about who the Lamb really was, right? And what the blood really accomplished, what we know as the Lord's Supper. But they finally are released. He finally relents, Pharaoh does. And under Moses' leadership, Moses and Aaron's leadership, they leave Egypt. And it says that God didn't take them the shortest route to Egypt or to Israel, to the promised land, because that was through Philistine country. And they might be so afraid of being at war or going to war with the Philistines that the Israelites would turn back and go to Egypt. So he took them through the desert, through the wilderness. And the first obstacle they faced was the Red Sea. And how do we get across? Particularly now that the Pharaoh has changed his mind and he sent the army to bring us home, bring us back. Well, they're in a dilemma. Of course, that's the first of many lessons about the power of God that Israel's going to get to visibly witness and God divides the Red Sea. They cross on dry land. They're protected. They're provided for. And you'd think, okay, problem solved. These people are going to be easy. They're going to be faithful. They're going to know God's power. They're going to understand God's power. They're going to trust God's power, right? No. It's not it at all. In fact, just like us, okay? I can point my finger at them and laugh. But I'm going to tell you something. When you look in the mirror and realize we do exactly the same thing, it's not so funny, is it? Not so funny. It's not long until they're whining and complaining. In fact, it gets so bad that they say, why in the world did you even bring us out here to die when we could have been eating the fresh vegetables back in Egypt? I think they forgot about the straw and the bricks and the slavery and all that stuff, right? Amazing. God continued providing for them. We've got, in order to fulfill God's promise of making a great nation, we've got the number of people, and now they're free men. They're on their way to what God promises is going to be their home. And that's going to fulfill at least two of the demands of a great nation. And Abraham's descendants becoming as numerous as the stars and the sand and so forth. But something else really important has to occur, because anybody can be a nation. Okay? Anybody can be a nation. Really, all you need is people in a place to be a nation, right? But if you're going to be a great nation, what are you going to have? You're going to have some instructions from God. You're going to have God's will if you're going to be a great nation. So that's what happens. They come to Mount Sinai, and of course, the very famous for all of us, Moses and the bringing down of the Ten Commandments and the worship of the idol god that was taking place, all kind of beautiful, amazing, beautiful only in the sense that it's so filled with lessons and applications for us. Not beautiful because it was faithfulness to God, but God delivers to them the most eloquent, extensive law that's ever been given to man. I mean, a great nation is an understatement, because they have the opportunity to be governed by God himself, right? He's going to be their king. God's explained himself. Really what the law of Moses does is tell the nation of Israel, this is who I am, God, and this is how I live. This is my character. This is my nature. And if you're going to be my nation, my people, my children, this is what you need to be. This is what you need to do. This is how you need to live. We'll save the discussion about how well they did that, and we do that for our New Testament section of this series. But let's suffice it at this point. They've got a number of people. They've got the prospect of a promised land to inherit. And now they've got a great law that's going to make them a great nation. And they finally come to the borders of that possession land, that promised land. And they send in some spies to discover whether it's doable or not. Now you think about that, and we are automatically a little skeptical. Well, why didn't they just go on in? Well, God was the one that told them to send in spies. Okay? It was God's idea. But part of the reason is because, and I'm not questioning God, I'm not saying this is why God had reasons that were his own. But one of the reasons had to be the fact that, okay, we're dealing with a nation of people that have been slaves all their lives. They were born slaves, okay? They were born slaves. And since they've been released from slavery, all they've done is wander or be led through the wilderness by God. And they're going to become a great nation. Some things are going to have to change in the way they think, the way they do business, right? They're going to have to listen to God. Well, the first command is cross the Jordan River. Cross the Jordan River. It's yours for the taking. And the spies come back and they say, man, is it ever a land flowing with milk and honey? Two of the spies come back, and it took them both to carry a cluster of grapes. That's pretty big. That's pretty amazing. Never seen anything like that. Never have. And that's what's growing wild over there. It's there, there for the having. And most of the spies come back and say, yes, all that's true, but there's people there too. And they're big. They're organized. They've built cities, and they got walls around them, and they got armies. In fact, we look like grasshoppers compared to them. We can't do this. We're not warriors. We have no army. We can't do this. But there's two of the spies that said, wait a minute, guys. We can't do this. But hasn't God already proven to you that he can? What are we questioning here? What are we doubting? What are we wondering about? I mean, wasn't it God that parted the Red Sea? Wasn't it God that gave us food everywhere we went, and the manna fell from heaven and had water from rocks, and our shoes never wore out and we never got lost? Why would we doubt that God's going to do what he said he's going to do? Well, they did. They did. You know that story. So God told them, turn around. I mean, they can see, okay? They can see it. It's here. Everything that's been, history's been leading up to, it's just across the river. To have. And they can't see it. So God says, turn around. Turn around. Don't even look that way anymore. You go the other direction. You go back in the wilderness. And for 40 years, until all of that whole generation of adults died. That's a lot of death, isn't it? A lot of dying in the wilderness. Except for two men. The kids and two men. Who were they? The next leader of Israel, well, really both of the next, in a sense, Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb. Joshua becomes the successor or the one to follow in Moses Moses. I get so tangled up with names at this point. Cramming 50 things into this little brain is hard. He's his successor. And then there's Caleb, who's his, I'm not going to say right-hand man, but man, I admire Caleb. I'm going to tell you this, just a little freebie I'm going to throw in there. Caleb was such a brave character that whenever it came time to conquer and decide who's going to conquer what part of the land, he said, give me the toughest you got. I'll take care of it. I'm paraphrasing, but that's kind of what he said. He was a full of faith man. He said, just give me the mountains. That's where I'll take it. I'll take care of it. The only two people that were adults that saw the Jordan River the first time got to come back the second time. Out of maybe 1.5 million, I don't know, whatever the number is. Like a large number. And now they've got to decide for the second time, are we going to cross the Jordan River? And of course, this is where, because of Moses having rebelled, disobeyed God, he's been told you're not going to be able to actually lead the people in. I'm going to show you that you see it, but you're not going to actually get to cross it. And that's what happens. And Joshua becomes the new leader, intimidated, much like Moses had been, frightened, and God says, don't be afraid. He says it over and over, in fact, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, I've got this. I'm going to be like a fortified wall for you. You don't have anything to worry about, anything to be concerned about. And he begins the process of leading the children of Israel finally after 40 years. And that's where the 40 years in the wilderness is, by the way. It didn't take them 40 years to get there. It just took them 40 years to have enough faith to cross the river. Okay, that's the gist of it. But Joshua's the leader who's going to take them across finally and begin the process of conquering the land. And that takes us all the way to, in Old Testament history, the end of the book of Deuteronomy and the beginning of the book of Joshua. Okay? So we covered Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy in 20 minutes. I'm impressed. I can do it. And I'm going to tell you, I do think there's a value in what we're doing. But at the same time, we're hopping over so many things that are so powerful, so amazing about how God's working to bring about his plan and his will. Sometimes with men cooperating and sometimes with men dragging both heels, kicking and screaming and resisting. But God's will moves forward. It continues on. One of the lessons, and there's so many, that every time I read through or study through this portion of Old Testament history, I can't help but be moved by, is the fact that the nation of people who came to the Jordan River the first time and looked across and saw what was there had the opportunity to walk across and inherit it for their own. It was theirs for the having, not for the taking. God was already taking it. For the having, okay? It was theirs for the having. And they couldn't find the courage to do it. And the reason is simple. You can make it complicated if you want, but the reason is simple. They didn't trust God. They didn't really believe God meant what he said, had the power to do what he promised. And you know what, folks? That's what it boils down to for us, too. That's exactly what it boils down to. It always has and it always will. Is God strong enough to do what he promises? And is he someone that we can put our weight down on and say, I don't know, I don't understand, that I hadn't got all the details, but I have full confidence. I trust. Because if we can say that, if we can live that way, man, unimaginable. I mean, a bunch of slaves get to live in a house they didn't build and drink water from a well they didn't dig and harvest crops from plants they didn't plant. All because God said, here, have it, in fulfillment to a promise. It's no different for us. It's not a physical land. It's not not saying he doesn't bless us, because he does. That's really not the point. It wasn't even the point back then. It's certainly not anymore. Trust God, have faith in God. That begins, well, maybe it does. Maybe it begins a little before that, but it certainly initially manifested in us becoming his child. Us saying, I don't know why. I don't understand how it can be, but you promised to forgive. I'm willing to repent. I'm willing to confess. I'm willing to participate by faith in your death and resurrection, burial and resurrection. And I'm willing to wear the title of your son, your daughter, your child, and be faithful to it. Though I know I'm going to fall short, be faithful to it. Present my life best I can, whatever it is, warts and all. And that's all God's ever wanted, is to be our God and us be his people. That's all he's ever wanted, all he's ever asked for. If we can help you tonight or this evening in any way to become that, please let us help while we stand together and while we sing.
first 14 books for us. And after that, Ray, if you'll lead us in a closing prayer. But y'all be real supportive to the kids. They're back there doing some intense Bible memory, some Bible work, so that they hide God's word in their heart, so that they may not sin against God throughout the rest of their lives. Okay, so y'all get up here together. There's strength in numbers.